All right, great. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is Caitlin Saladino. I'm the Director of Strategic Development here at Brookings Mountain West. And on behalf of my colleagues here, Bill Brown, Ashley LeClaire, our Executive Director, Dave Demore, our entire student research team, I want to thank you for being here tonight for our final talk in the Fall 2023 Brookings Scholar Lecture Series. So thank you for coming out. I also want to take a moment to give a huge thanks to our donors whose support is integral to our entire operation, but really helps to support and make possible the events like the one you'll see tonight. I also want to take a brief moment to thank our team at UNLV TV who's helping us to record this lecture. Just like all of our events here in Greenspun Hall, these are recorded and archived on our website through our YouTube channel, so you can see them even after tonight and share them with your friends and colleagues who may not have been able to attend. We have many of these up on our YouTube page as well. We have over 115 recorded at this point, so you might find another topic that you're interested in as well, so be sure to check that out. This week, we've had the pleasure of welcoming back our friend and colleague, Vanda Felbab-Brown, to Brookings Mountain West. Just for some context, Vanda has visited us since 2013. So over the last decade, she's come in, offered her remarks and her expertise on everything from global water crimes, the future of Afghanistan, illegal wildlife trafficking, Mexican drug cartels, and the U.S. opioid epidemic. And tonight, we're really eager to hear from Vanda about the next item in her Brookings Mountain West resume, which is, of course, fentanyl trafficking. Like all our visiting scholars, Vanda's been busy this week meeting with students and faculty here at UNLV, administration, talking to coalition members in the community, and really getting a taste of our community here in Las Vegas. Vanda joins us this week from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where she is a senior fellow at the Strobe Talbert Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology in Brookings Foreign Policy Department. I'm going to invite Vanda to come up now. She also serves as the director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors and the co-director of the African Security Initiative at Brookings. She's an expert on international and internal conflicts and non-traditional security threats, including insurgency, organized crime, urban violence, and illicit economies. And her field work has led her all around the world to study these topics, not to mention the fact that she arrived to UNLV earlier this week straight from Iraq. Vanda also holds a doctorate in political science from MIT and a bachelor's in government from Harvard University. And for those of you that have attended many of our Brookings Scholar Lecture Series in the past, you may have noticed our format's a little bit different today, and that's because we're also going to be joined tonight by Dr. Sara Hunt, a UNLV colleague from the Kerkorian School of Medicine, and you can come on up if you would. She's going to also be commenting on this topic, offering a state and local perspective on the lecture. Sara serves as the Assistant Dean of Behavioral Health Sciences and will join Vanda to discuss the state of treatment services, the mental and behavioral health workforce in our region as they deliver response to individuals with substance use disorder. So after their discussion tonight, we will open up to the floor. So please save your questions for the end. I'll come around with the microphone. Without further ado, we'll turn things over to Vanda first. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, thank you very much, Caitlin, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's really an enormous pleasure for me to be back. It's just been every time absolutely delightful, educational, eye-opening to come to UNLV, to engage with colleagues at Brookings Mountain West, and to come to Las Vegas and Nevada. And wow, what a treat that this is the 10th year anniversary since the first time I came. I actually did not think about the fact that it is the 10th year anniversary. And I cannot think of a better virtual cake or symbolic cake than to be joined today on the podium by Dr. Sara Hunt. Really one of the most wonderful aspects and one of the goals of Brookings Mountain West is merging policy ideas, experiences, lessons, issues from the national level with the local level. So especially on something as devastating, as crucial as fentanyl, I'm really absolutely delighted that it's a joint show today on the stage, and hopefully far more than today joint stage, but collaborations on this issue. And very many thanks and congratulations to friends and colleagues in Brookings Mountain West for welcoming me back and for the really terrific time I have had here this week. Despite all the joy, we are going to be talking tonight about a very awful issue. The fentanyl epidemic is the latest and most lethal manifestation of what originated as the opioid epidemic in the United States in the mid-1990s. And already the opioid epidemic was an enormous crisis by U.S. standards. It is a drug crisis that has featured many more people with substance use disorder, the fancy word for addiction, than other drug crises. But for fentanyl, a synthetic drug further added to the crisis is the lethality. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. It's not derived out of opium poppy like heroin. It is produced industrially. And it's a drug that has very important legal uses. It's a crucial anesthetic in surgeries. And I hope that any of you will never have a surgery without having anesthetics, without having palliative care, one of which will likely feature fentanyl. But as chemical processes in the 1990s and early 2000s changed and simplified the method by which fentanyl is produced, it's no longer just produced in controlled settings for the medical industry. It's increasingly synthesized in informal illegal settings, sometimes diverted from formal factories, but often synthesized in illegal settings, illegal labs by criminal actors that then ship it, smuggle it to the United States. And so fentanyl started entering the market a decade ago, roughly as well, at the time when the opioid epidemic in the United States was already burgeoning and reaching very high stage, with vast numbers of Americans having addiction to some sort of opioid. And at the time, a decade ago, Chinese traders, some of which were Chinese criminal companies, others which were simply unscrupulous Chinese traders in the legal pharmaceutical, chemical industries, started supplying directly from China, shipping by mail, fentanyl to the United States. And over time, the use of fentanyl kept increasing and all of a sudden triggered those enormous lethality rates. The fentanyl epidemic today is the most lethal drug epidemic ever in history. And that's still in the context where it is confined to mostly North America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. But in a matter of time, in my view, fentanyl use, fentanyl supply will start on the illegal market, will start spreading to other parts of the world. There already are pockets of it emerging as far down south as Brazil and Argentina, in Europe. But in a matter of time, criminal groups will simply not be able to resist supplying fentanyl, in my view, across the world. Now, why is that? What is it so special about fentanyl that it's triggering these enormous lethality rates? And what are those lethality rates? Last year, 110,000 Americans died. This is a number that has been increasing by the magnitude of tens of thousands of Americans steadily since 2013, since 2014. The vast majority of those who died, who overdosed, were people who consumed some sort of mixture of fentanyl with something. So fentanyl accounted for the vast majority of deaths, often mixed to other substances. Another way to put the number 110,000 is to realize that 300 Americans are dying daily from drug overdose, mostly due to fentanyl. So we can go down and figure out the numbers of Americans dying as a result every minute. Already, fentanyl is the leading cause of deaths for Americans between the age of 18 and 49. people that tend to be healthy, that tend not to be experiencing morbidity and certainly mortality effects from other illnesses. And substance use disorders is an illness. It's a chronic illness. But fentanyl is also killing many of the young entrants into drug markets. Young people experiment with drugs. It's part of culture of growing up. Well, it's experimenting with fentanyl may be one experimentation, and the teenager is dead. And fentanyl is also killing on an unprecedented rate older Americans. So typically in drug markets, users will age out of using by the time they're 60, 65. For the first time in drug markets, we are seeing Americans over the age of 65 having their deaths quadrupled as a result of overdose. A lot of that has to connect or originates in a way that the opioid epidemic started with unscrupulous pharmaceutical companies lying to U.S. regulators, medical bodies, doctors, public at large, that the new opioids that they were selling at the time, drugs like Oxycontin, were not addictive. So many of the older Americans that are dying as a result of fentanyl overdose are those who have become addicted through, for example, Oxycontin or prescription pills, but all of a sudden they are getting drugs in which fentanyl is mixed. The reason fentanyl is so lethal is because of its chemical synthetic properties that give it enormous potency per weight. And there are other analogs, there are other versions of synthetic opioids, and there are other analogs that are even far more potent than fentanyl. Drugs like carfentanil are an even order of magnitude more potent than fentanyl. So for a user, it is extremely hard to know how to measure properly the dose, not to overdose. This is especially true for users who are early entrants into drug use or perhaps who have been out for a while. But all of this gets more complicated by the fact that dealers and suppliers, even at the wholesale level, are mixing fentanyls into essentially any drugs that's available on the market right now. So someone wants to go buy crystal meth, a very bad addiction with high morbidity rates, a very, very tough addiction to break, lots of bad consequences. The odds are that right now they will be buying some mixture of meth with fentanyl. Same is true about cocaine, other kinds of opioids. And for that matter, other kinds of synthetic designer drugs. And the reason that suppliers are doing that are various, but one of which is that the high potency ratio also means that people develop substance use disorder very quickly in limited exposure, limited dosage. So that's one. We have had the heads of the Sinaloa cartel, the Chapitos, talking about that they want to create streets of American junkies. They have a purposefully desired plan to get as many people on mass addicted as possible to feed their drug empire. So these came out in wiretap recordings of the U.S. Department of Justice and the indictments against the Chapitos. But the other big reason is that because these drugs are so potent, they are also very easy to smuggle. It's maybe 1/10 or even less than 1/10 of the total amount one needs to supply the entire U.S. market with synthetic opioids like fentanyl than it takes with cocaine or heroin. So the evasion problems to escape law enforcement are much simplified. You need just much less of the drug to supply the market, and the smaller amount you need to smuggle, the easier it is to hide. And moreover, because these are produced synthetically, they are produced in labs, you don't need to control territory to cultivate opium poppy or coca that are visible. You need lots of territorial control. You don't need this. So from traffickers' perspective, it's enormously appealing to reach for these synthetic drugs, even though their public health consequences are absolutely devastating. And the fentanyl crisis, it's really just the latest or one particular manifestation of a broader revolution in synthetic drugs that the world is going through. Recreational drug markets, illegal drug markets around the world are in one way or another switching robustly towards synthetic drugs. Even a place like Afghanistan, long associated with the production of opium poppy, the place where 90% of opium was produced for 2 decades, is now having the development of crystal meth market. But a very good crystal meth, but nonetheless development of crystal meth market. One other dimension that is really important to bring into the conversation is that even the fentanyl market itself is changing. So not only do we have fentanyl mixed into heroin, cocaine, meth, fake prescription pills that are sold as oxycodone, but are some form of fentanyl. But now we are also seeing the introduction of other additives, drugs like xylazine, tranquilizers, which are improving for some users the sense of high, but at the same time are creating further massive public health risks. Lots of these drugs are, first of all, compounding morbidity. Users are likely to develop necrotic tissues and have to have amputations of their limbs, resulting in just absolute devastation of their lives, obviously. But very critically, these drugs are also not responding to the principal primary response to reverse overdose that opioids like fentanyl are, which is a drug that's called Narcan. The commercial name is Narcan. It's essentially a drug that reverses overdose, restores basic life functioning systems. So the actual number of people who overdose as a result of fentanyl in the United States are multiple times the number of people who die. So I mentioned 110,000 dying last year. The number of overdoses are multiple that number, perhaps 5, 6, 7 times higher. And the reason that, quote unquote, only 110 Americans have died is because Narcan, naloxone, that's the chemical name, reversed the overdose. But the addition of drugs like xylazine, tranquilizers, likely means that a lot of the overdoses will not be reversed because these drugs are not responding. So we could potentially be in a situation where we are going to have rapidly another massive escalation as these drugs are entering into the market. Now, I look forward to hearing from Sara how these challenges are playing out. Before I hand it over to you, let me just reflect on 2 dimensions, and that's the role of China and Mexico in this. The United States and Canada are the principal retail markets for fentanyl and fentanyl mixtures. Where does the drug come from? I said it's synthetically made in labs. Now, well, where are these labs? Where are they made from? So a decade ago, China was the place where illegal fentanyl was synthesized and shipped to the United States, sometimes directly by postal services, mail carriers, or hidden in cargo. As a result of intense U.S. diplomacy across several administrations, in May 2019, China scheduled the entire class of fentanyl drugs. What does it mean, scheduled? It didn't ban them. It didn't declare them illegal. I mentioned fentanyl has a crucial role in the medical, in healthcare. Scheduling means that every aspect of their production, importation, trade, export are controlled. And when that happened, Chinese suppliers, highly responsive to intense police state or valiant police state in China, switched into shipping not the finished fentanyl itself directly to the US, but instead shipping what's called precursors to Mexican cartels. Precursors are the base chemicals from which drugs like fentanyl are synthesized. Many of these precursor chemicals today are drugs that are widespread use in basic chemistry, basic agricultural, basic pharmaceutical production. They are not just dual use, they are multiple use. So it's very unlikely that they will be scheduled. But even the fact that these drugs have widespread use, are legal chemicals, often with limited controls on them, doesn't mean that there can be any control. And the U.S. Department of Justice, U.S. government have really led innovative work this spring and summer showing how Chinese traders knowingly, purposefully are selling these chemicals to Mexican cartels with the explicit knowledge that the cartels will use them for the production of fentanyl, and made indictments despite the fact that the chemicals themselves are legal and not regulated. And this was very important because it took away one of China's constant arguments: we cannot mount any law enforcement or regulatory action because these drugs are not scheduled. Now, China was making this claim because for several years it's really been not willing to cooperate with the U.S. in suppressing fentanyl flows. China says there is no fentanyl misuse in China. That's possible. It's hard to know because one doesn't have a transparent country, but it's possible that fentanyl has not reached illegal markets in China. There are big drug markets in China, illegal drug markets, but it's quite possible that fentanyl deaths are not recorded. And China would previously cooperate, like in the May 2019 scheduling, by defining it as a grand humanitarian gesture to the U.S. China would say, look, your fentanyl problem is because your society is corrupt, it's your awful values, your self-indulgence, you don't have the discipline and the morals that we have in China. It is also the fault of your legal pharmaceutical companies. But there is a correct claim. This is none of our problem, but out of our grand humanitarian sympathy toward you, we will crack down, we will schedule the fentanyl type class of drugs. But after the scheduling, and in all of its law enforcement cooperation, China expects to get strategic benefits. It expects to be paid off in lessening of the competition between the two countries. And in fact, across the Trump administration and the Biden administration, we've seen the opposite. The competition has really ramped up. And when this happened, when China didn't get the effects it expected, it pulled back from law enforcement cooperation and essentially fully stopped it for several years. So just 2 weeks ago, we have had a summit between President Xi and President Biden, and China has committed itself at this summit to start acting against Chinese companies and entities that are knowingly selling precursors to Mexican cartels. China's also put out notices to the Chinese pharmaceutical chemical industries that there is now going to be monitoring and controls on precursors. That's a great development. We have to hope that the will to enforce will not be too limited and too narrow. In the final stage, or second to final stage of the supply, we have also, unfortunately, not had good cooperation with Mexico. Mexico is our neighbor country. It's a country that the United States is deeply intertwined with economically, socially, and family ties. Yet it is a country that's deeply challenged by criminal groups that are gaining increasing territorial, political, and economic power, not just in the illegal economies like drug trafficking, but also in legal economies. Entities like the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación and the Sinaloa cartel, the two largest suppliers of fentanyl to the United States, the dominant suppliers, are also taking over legal agriculture in Mexico, legal logging, fishing, water supply. And in the past decades, Mexico has struggled and more or less failed in conducting an effective law enforcement and police reform. The judicial reforms have also struggled to really reduce the culture of impunity and strengthen rule of law. So much so that in Mexico for the past 20, 30 years, maybe 2% of murders result in prosecution. So think of 100 murders committed, for only 2 people will go to prison. Essentially, you're free to get away with murder. And in this very poor context, very poor rule of law context, the cartels have been very powerful. And over the past 5 years, the administration of President Andrés López Obrador has been more or less unwilling to mount any kind of systematic and robust law enforcement policy toward the cartel. Every so often, under U.S. pressure, it arrests particular leaders. The recent one was just last week, where the chief enforcer of the Sinaloa cartel, someone named as Eldini, was arrested. But previously, with U.S. intelligence acting at U.S. behest, the Mexican government arrested one of the leaders of the cartel, Ovidio Guzman, who's been extradited to the U.S. But those hits at the top are insufficient in the action that needs to be taken against fentanyl flows and more broadly to weaken the cartels and their spread and power in Mexico and to strengthen the rule of law in Mexico. Mexico is heading into elections next year, just as we are. The issues of cooperation, law enforcement will be very important in the political electoral campaigns of both countries. And hopefully, like with China, we will get to a stage where at least there is a promise of greater cooperation than we have had so far. Now, this, of course, all is playing out in dramatic, concrete ways in local settings. I know so many people who have been affected by fentanyl, who have relatives dying of fentanyl, or students who have their friends dying of fentanyl. I'm sure it's not so different here in Las Vegas, and Sara, I look forward to hearing from you how this is playing out here.
Thank you, Vanda. I could just sit and listen to you talk for the rest of the hour. It's so interesting, the experiences you have, the data that you have. So thank you. I appreciate being involved in this important talk tonight. So I'm not going to bring a lot of data. What I do want to direct you to, and I see probably students in the room that maybe are here that need to write a response paper about this evening. But if you want to look at kind of Nevada data on fentanyl, on overdose of non-lethal overdose, I will direct you to the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Data Analytics. So if you just do a Google search for that, there's a tab that says behavioral health, and you can click on that, and it will give you the opportunity to look at data by county, by statewide, by Las Vegas, by Henderson. So Nevada Department of Health and Human Services Office of Analytics. I think the most recent data they have is from 2021. So it sometimes takes about a year to make sure we have the most up-to-date numbers on that. But I will just say in general, and I won't take up too much time because I'm sure there are questions in the audience, but Las Vegas and Nevada are not immune to this issue with fentanyl and the devastating impact it has on our communities. So we're certainly seeing that in all parts of the state. And I'll just talk about kind of a response to that from a mental and behavioral health perspective. So I'm a psychologist by training. And one of the things I'll talk about is sometimes our struggle to be able to treat this is related to our shortage of mental and behavioral health professionals that we have in the state. If you've lived here for any length of time, you probably have heard that. That should be no new news. We are short of psychiatrists, psychologists, addictions counselors, marriage and family therapists, all of them, social workers. So one of the things that we are trying to do here out of UNLV in the Nevada system of higher education is to grow our own pipeline of mental and behavioral health professionals. So we are not the only state that struggles with meeting the mental health care needs, the substance use care needs of our state. And there have been some other states that have been very successful at investing in going out to do recruitment and education in the K through 12 system about mental and behavioral health professions, giving those students an opportunity to hear about the different opportunities to work in this field and then connect them to the higher ed system. train them, and then work on that retention piece. So if they graduate from one of our mental and behavioral health training programs, how do we get them to stay in the state? So through a recent bill in the last legislative session here in Nevada, Assembly Bill 37, we got approved to establish a behavioral health workforce center now housed at UNLV. And it's a long name, but just stick with me. It shortens to really cute, something really cute. So in the coming year, we will be introducing everyone to the Behavioral Health Education, Retention, and Expansion Network of Nevada, which shortens to Be Here Nevada. So the purpose of Be Here Nevada will be to go out in the K through 12 systems across the state and start talking about mental health issues and how those students might want the opportunity to learn more about those fields and work in the fields. My hunch is that at this point in time, related to the fentanyl and opioid pandemics that we had, we also just came out of a horrible COVID-19 pandemic. And so I'm assuming there's a lot of people with lived experience now with a mental health, emotional response to what we've been living through. And so those are the students, also potential adults that are looking for a career change that I would love to talk to about the benefits of working in mental behavioral health. So that's one thing. And then just back to kind of a state response to the opioid crisis and the fentanyl crisis. There's been a lot of work being done at the state level to try and do some prevention work around this, intervention work as well, and recovery work. So if you pay attention to the news, you probably have heard different times where Nevada has been part of a lawsuit related to the pharmaceutical companies and all the opioids that they pushed out. And we've been successful in some of those lawsuits. So now the state, through legislative action, is pooling that money, and it's in the millions, and to a fund that they're calling the Fund for Resilient Nevada. So this is work that's just starting to kind of come together and roll out. So the purpose of this Fund for Resilient Nevada is to push out the money that the state is getting from these settlements and make it available to communities, to counties, state-level programming to do preventative work about opioid use. And that could look like certainly doing things in the K through 12 system, but just in communities in general. How do we get people informed about fentanyl? How do we get them informed about the dangers of fentanyl, how it pops up, how you can buy it on social media, those type of things. So the preventative work is very important, but there's also money that will be put out towards treatment. So we need more treatment options in the state of Nevada. That can look like anything from just traditional outpatient help for those struggling with substance use disorder, with fentanyl addiction, opioid addiction, all the way up to we need more residential long-term treatment options for this issue. And then the recovery piece as well. So once folks have gone through treatment successfully, what do we need to do as a community to help support them in that long-term recovery? And so there is, if you are interested in learning more about the Fund for Resilient Nevada, if you Google that as well, that will come up and you'll be able to see how the state is going to spend each of those dollars, their goals for that. They have a most recent annual report, I think from 2021, about how that's rolling out. There's also a great site called the Nevada State Opioid Response, and that is a very good resource website if you're interested in learning how you can obtain Narcan. So again, Narcan is that it kind of looks like an inhaler that you could have on hand and use if you come across someone who has overdosed and is unresponsive. So they give you sites that you can go and get that. It's pretty available now over the counter in most of your pharmacies if you go to CVS, Walgreens, that type of thing. But they also have places where you can go and get test strips to test your drug to test a drug to see if there's the presence of fentanyl in there. So they'll give you sites that you can do that as well. So that's all just to say that there are a lot of things that the state is recognizing. We have got to get ahead of this as much as we can. We've got to respond as much as we can, and using these settlement dollars to do that work. So I will kind of stop there at this point. But although this is a very dark and sometimes a topic that feels like there's maybe no hope with that, there are people that are trying to do the work, and I hope that you'll be seeing and hearing more about that as it's rolling out across our communities.
If possible, before we transition to full group, I just want to pose one last question to the two of you. We've looked at this topic at various levels of the policy landscape, sort of from a transnational all the way down to a local level. I'm curious, from your various vantage points, where are some of the best practices in policy change that you are seeing? And what are some of those policy actions that you might see a place like Nevada taking into account and taking into consideration to help address this problem?
Would you like to start?
Sure. So from a policy perspective, there's actually a lot of things being kind of determined right now at the federal level as well, as far as how we're responding to the opioid crisis, the funding from the federal government that's continuing to come to the state for that. So best practices, if you're interested and you work in mental and behavioral health, one of the places that we kind of go to for what we call a list of evidence-based treatments. So what is the best way to treat depression? What is the best way to treat the opioid use disorders is through the Substance and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. So if on SAMHSA, they have an ongoing list of evidence-based treatments. But in general, for treating and responding to substance use disorder, opioid use disorder, it really is a matter of having the right treatment in the right place at the right time for that person. And there's not just one. I will say that kind of best practices right now includes involving that person in traditional kind of talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, along with medication-assisted treatment. So using medications to treat the opioid use disorder. That's kind of a go-to practice right now. And that can be difficult because physicians, we have a shortage of physicians who are approved to provide that medication-assisted treatment. So that's another initiative that the state has really been involved in trying to get like primary care providers more comfortable with prescribing these medications. If that happens, often though that's happening for the patient in kind of a vacuum. So their doctor is over here prescribing the medication-assisted treatment. Maybe they have a therapist over here, maybe not. If they do, those two folks really need to partner together to provide kind of person whole-centered care. And so from a policy perspective, I see even in our last local legislative session here in Nevada, Assembly Bill 156 was passed. There's a number of things in that bill that made it easier and more accessible to get medication-assisted therapy in the state, including giving pharmacists the ability to, if they know that their patient, their customer, has a diagnosed opioid use disorder, they can also assess them for that, then the pharmacist themselves now has the ability to write that prescription and dispense that. So there's a lot of things in that bill that, again, is just making it easier for folks to learn about medication-assisted therapy and get them that treatment that they need.
Well, terrific. Let me just echo the 3 points you highlighted. Medication-assisted treatment, test strips, and Narcan,
Yes.
the overdose reversing medication, all of which might seem completely intuitive, but getting the United States, getting states in the United States to accept those has taken several decades. So for a long time, the prevailing view on drug policy management in the United States was to definitely oppose these kind of interventions that are sometimes called harm reduction measures. They include others such as safe needle exchange or supervised injection sites. And perhaps one of the silver linings of the opioid and fentanyl crisis is that we finally have moved toward much more informed, much more evidence-based response toward users, to a much more accepted recognition that substance use disorder is not just it's not a moral failure, it's a chronic illness that needs to be treated as a chronic illness. That said, we're still very far away from what we need to be doing at the user, at the patient level. You talked about the challenges with the number of physicians, number of therapists available. Many people who have substance use disorders do not want to avail themselves of treatment in the first place, but even people who do want it often find that effective treatment is available to only 15% of users who are requesting it. 15, not 5015. Enormously small number in a context where 300 Americans are dying yearly. So there's a massive amount of work that still needs to be done, very long road ahead. But we know some things that work. We know things that save lives and that stabilize people to make their life better, to make their life socially, physically, psychologically functional, that even if they cannot get away from substance use disorders altogether, they're far better able to live with it and hopefully not overdose and die. Let me just leave it at that so we have plenty of time for questions from the audience.
I was wondering, what would be the cost of actually getting these precursors scheduled?
Caitlin, do you need me to repeat the question for the mic?
If possible.
Okay. So the question,
okay.
Go ahead.
I was wondering, what would be the economic cost of getting these precursors scheduled? And can't the UN do something about it, worldwide?
Well, so I don't actually have the number. So if you just think of the size of the pharmaceutical industries globally around the world, we're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars worth, maybe a higher number than that. Many of the precursors for fentanyl, but also for other drugs like crystal meth, are increasingly very basic chemicals. They're just ever present and used globally. So while I don't know the economic cost of scheduling them, I can anticipate very strongly that the political resistance will be enormous. You will have vast, powerful industries that are important economic engines, but that are also very politically powerful actors in countries like the United States, India, China, other countries with large chemical pharmaceutical industries in Europe, in other parts of the world saying, no scheduling of these chemicals. Now, again, scheduling doesn't mean you cannot produce them or you cannot transport them, you cannot export them, you just have to do it with controls. But I don't think that it's politically likely in any kind of immediate future. And certainly at the level of the international community, I think it's even tougher just than at the level of an individual country. But again, I don't think that we have to be obsessed with scheduling per se. One of the important effects of the U.S. spring and summer indictments were precisely that you can show that even if the chemical is legal and not scheduled, as long as it's purposefully, knowingly heading for criminal purposes, you can take strong U.S. law enforcement action. And this is really what I want to be seeing in our international law enforcement collaboration efforts. The Biden administration has very appropriately started focusing on synthetic drugs at the global level as well. in the summer of this year, it launched the Global Coalition Against the Threat of Synthetic Drugs that had about 90 countries joining. Some very important countries did not join so far. China is a prime example. But my expectation is that the coalition will grow. Now, it's one thing to have a coalition on paper or in ether, but what kind of practical actions countries will take, what kind of collaboration and law enforcement assistance will take place, that's where the rubber meets the road. But again, I think that if we just focus on scheduling, we are taking us in the wrong policy direction. Or in the delayed policy direction. We can have effective law enforcement collaboration even without scheduling. Now, more broadly, I would like U.S. policy to stop focusing on maybe just the narrow fentanyl flows itself, or Mexican cartels or Chinese criminal groups, but more broadly think about the entire spectrum of activities in which they engage. So the Biden administration talks about the whole of government approach to fentanyl. What I would really like to see is the whole of government approach to criminal groups that as much targets their wildlife trafficking aspects of their portfolio or their connections to government actors as the specific fentanyl flows. Clearly, fentanyl is a priority, but getting and reducing the power of the criminal groups, their ability to smuggle fentanyl, will be enhanced if we target very robustly and expansively their other activities as well.
On both the international and the national stage, are there states or countries that are doing better jobs of dealing with this issue, and are other states or countries able to deal from the ones that are really excelling at dealing with this issue?
Sara, you want to do any comparative stuff?
That is a great question, and I don't have a good answer for that. So
well, let me
kick it over.
Say a few things. So look, British Columbia and Vancouver are highlighted localities, one within the other, as the place in the world where you have the most politically accepted, for a whole number of years, harm reduction approaches. It's a place where harm reduction approaches are also far more robustly funded and really cover a wide panoply of different interventions than most other places in the world. But even Vancouver and British Columbia have opioid use problems on par with some of the worst hit places in the United States and very significant fentanyl problems. Which doesn't mean that we should go away from harm reduction, from treatment, from availability of Narcan, that we should go back to bad policies like arresting users and putting them in prison. No, we shouldn't do that. But it's just one example of how much, how difficult this issue is, and how one really needs a full spectrum of policy action, including trying to get at reducing the supply, the law enforcement elements, along with the treatment harm reduction elements. There is wide experimentation going on across U.S. states and sometimes across small municipalities. And interesting challenges are coming up. I'm a big supporter of safe needle exchange. Save lives, reduces disease, reduces spreadable, communicable diseases like hepatitis, HIV/AIDS. Great thing. For the first time, the city of New York in Bronx has a safe needle exchange place. As is not rare in these contexts, people with substance use congregate around it. They might be poor, they might be socially struggling with various manifestations. There are needles, trash around the site. And the community is rebelling and resisting and saying, we don't want it, shut it down. Even though it is a good intervention. So having a good intervention does not ipso facto mean that implementation is easy. There might need to be adjustments to implementation. Mm-hmm. Places like San Francisco and Oregon have embraced drug policy reform very robustly and decriminalized the entire spectrum of drugs. So it's not just that cannabis is legal at these localities, but heroin, cocaine, fentanyl are illegal, but users will not be criminally punished. And in some cases, there is really minimal state action at local retail markets. Well, both places, Oregon and San Francisco, are really struggling with big rise in crime. They're having very high overdose rates. That is not necessarily surprising. There are good ways to decriminalize and less good ways, less effective ways to decriminalize. Decriminalization can mean a wide spectrum of what it actually means in practice. But as a result of combination of factors, one of which is decriminalization. It's not the sole factor. You have high homelessness, COVID effects in both places, collapse of urban economic life because of COVID, people moving out into the suburb, businesses shutting down. Nonetheless, this has created a perfect storm where people in these communities are saying, we don't want decriminalization, bring back the tough law enforcement, start acting tough against drug markets. Even though many of the policies of acting tough toward users, having aggressive law enforcement in retail markets have over decades produced very many disastrous effects. So we're at the moment of policy reform being implemented and challenges with what this means rising as well. Behind you, Caitlin.
Thank you. Thank you for an interesting talk. I was curious, as far as fentanyl, how much, is there a breakdown between how much maybe manufactured in the United States and how much is coming from offshore? Is there any way to?
Yeah. The vast majority of fentanyl that is sold in the U.S. market is synthesized in Mexico. There is also some synthesis in the United States, but more importantly, some precursors are heading from the US to Mexico. But the overwhelming supply chain is precursors from China to Mexico, synthesis of precursors into fentanyl in Mexico, smuggling mostly across the US southern border into the United States.
With respect to the synthesis of fentanyl inside of Mexico, once you have the precursors, how difficult is it to establish these factories that are able to do this, and how expensive is it to synthesize it?
Well, so one of the other bad consequences or bad elements, characteristics of fentanyl, unfortunately, is that it's extraordinarily cheap. The amount of expense that it takes to buy the precursors for fentanyl is a tiny fraction of what it would cost to buy precursors and chemicals you need, for example, for heroin or cocaine extraction. And so much so that probably for the entire U.S. yearly market, or North American market, also including Canada, we are probably looking only at tens of millions of dollars for precursors. It's nothing. The amount of money realized down in the illegal economy is far greater. And that has many bad aspects to it. One is, importing is very cheap. It's easy for criminal groups to buy it, to smuggle it from China or potentially India. But it also means that all of a sudden criminal groups can be paying for the precursor not just in cash or not in cryptocurrencies, but also in other commodities like wildlife. It's very inefficient to pay for heroin in wildlife. You would need tremendous volumes of wildlife. But in Mexico, we are seeing the Mexican criminal groups really intensifying poaching of terrestrial and marine species and logging, and using those commodities to pay Chinese traders for fentanyl precursors and meth precursors, but mostly fentanyl precursors. And that's because China is a place where there's vast consumption of wildlife products, as well as vast consumption of timber for a whole set of users, industrial and non-industrial. And so the cheapness of fentanyl and precursors has created this convergence of two illegal economies and has these devastating environmental effects in Mexico. The biodiversity is under tremendous pressure because it's paying for the precursors.
We have time probably for a couple more questions.
Yeah, what do you think of the technologies that are in development to combat the drug trafficking?
You want to think of some on the health side?
I can talk about the use of technology in the treatment. So that is a growing area just in general in treating mental and behavioral health and substance use issues. So the way we think about kind of going to your traditional therapist office, sitting there getting a session for an hour, we're going to have to start rethinking that because there are the development of more apps that are being used for behavioral health support. You can download any number of them that will walk you through different meditation or mindful exercises, that type of thing. But they're also developing more into being almost kind of a support to traditional therapy used with your therapist. But also AI is another area that we in mental health need to start paying attention to and figuring out what does that mean and how we provide treatment. So that's just kind of one indication about technology. And in our meeting yesterday, I was just mentioning, if you follow the Nevada Independent, there was a really interesting article, I think it was yesterday, about a teen up in northern Nevada who's developing an app for to alert communities if there's a bad batch of a certain drug out there that's laced with fentanyl. So there's more of a community heads up that this is out there and to be on the alert for that. So I think that's a really interesting use of technology. And the more that we're all kind of using our phones for so many different things these days, it makes sense to think about how we need to use technology in this area too. As far as drug trafficking, what are your thoughts?
Yeah,
on that?
no, I mean, certainly robust entry of technologies, evolving technologies into both the criminal side of the trafficking and law enforcement response. Whether it's the use of cryptocurrencies to move money and launder money or make payments, whether it's the use of drones to fly supply, both drones to fly drugs to your window, or hopefully not your window, but someone's window, to actually wholesale supply of drugs across the U.S. Mexico border by drones. Previously, we have seen the development of submarines and first semi-submersibles and today even full submarines that non-state armed actors developed for the smuggling of contraband like cocaine. So this has not been the case in the fentanyl space because the precursors are so limited, they're easy to hide in cargo from Chinese ports heading into Mexico. But in cocaine smuggling, we have seen some semi-submersibles and full submarines leaving places like Colombia and Venezuela and heading across the Atlantic Ocean to West Africa or heading up north to Central America or Mexico, unloading cocaine. Criminal groups have even embraced lethal drones to fight law enforcement or intimidate communities. And on the law enforcement side, of course, we have all these mechanisms as well to what is called wiretap today involves far other technologies than someone wearing a mic taped to their chest underneath the jacket in a clandestine operation. It's hacking penetrations of communications, other devices to be tracking illegal conversations. It involves much more powerful scanning technology. But as has been the case in history, going back to the emergence of a police force, it's a cat and mouse game. As law enforcement adapts new technologies, criminals learn from it and adapt it too.
Absolutely. We have no more time for questions today, but I want to ask you to help me in thanking Vanda and Sara for their time this evening. If you'll join me in a round of applause. Thank you for the expertise on this really important topic. I know we have lots to think about with this, and if you have any other questions that you would like to ask, Sara and Vanda will be here for just a little bit afterwards. And I want to thank you all, especially those of you that came out to many of our presentations this semester for the fall Brookings Scholar Lecture Series. It was a delight to have you all here, and we hope to see you back in the spring. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Perfect.